Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of season 2 of Bios and Bookmarks, an online reading series featuring Caribbean authors powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. My name is Shivani Ramlochan, and joining me today is Trinidadian Canadian author Rabindranath Maharaj. Robin to his friends. Robin, welcome and thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome, Shivani.
So, those who are familiar with Robin's work may know that he is a prolific author of several novels, the most recent of which is Fatboy Fall Down, published by ECW Press. It's a name you're not likely to forget anytime soon. And it's also an unforgettable novel for many reasons. It has a singularly unique main character who completely challenges the idea of what a hero should be, and he lives through some very unheroic events. And Robin, I immensely enjoyed reading Fatboy Fall Down, and I think our audience who's joining us from all over the world, thank you for being here, will enjoy you reading from the book. So I invite you to share a reading now.
Thanks, Shivani. So I'm going to read a bit from the very beginning of the book. When he was 58 years old and preparing for his retirement in a slumberous cocoa village nestled within a valley's crook, orbits would look at the parakeets, so tiny and green they could be mistaken from a distance for skittering leaves. And he would recall his dream of reading the weather report with a macaw perched on his shoulder. The bungalow, its walls wrinkled by vines that trailed from the lemon and guava trees and seemed to glide into the open windows, he had coveted for half his life, and his ease in acquiring it at an affordable price encouraged him into speculating about other long delayed pursuits. He would visit his daughter, whom he had not heard from nor seen for over a decade. He would populate the pond at the back of his house with red tilapia and augment the yard with fruit trees, cashews, mangoes, custard apples, cherries, and plums. He would attend to his growing vision problems and finally finish his meteorology course. All of this he mentioned in letters to Wally, his old friend from the Ministry of Agriculture. It was Wally who, before his relocation to Toronto, had introduced him to life in the capital and who had explained to Orbitz how aspects of the island's past had ingrained themselves into a culture of lime, an unexpected generosity, always twinned with reproach. Wally, too, had noted that the faddishness of the boom years did not completely displace the old way of thinking. The refusal to be persuaded, the childish presumptuousness, the nursing of grudges, the fear of competition, the absolute dread of being ignored. Wally's heart attack had preceded Orbit's by a few years, and in a letter, Orbitz had joked about both men resting side by side on hospital beds. But Wally had survived his heart attack. In the evenings, Orbitz walked across the yard of the old shop where tufts of nut grass sprouted from concrete and asphalt, and he mentioned his plans to the skeptical shopkeeper. Just a few months again for my pension, he told the shopkeeper. I have my bucket list. The shopkeeper, offended by Orbit's optimism, replied, careful that bucket don't tumble down the hill and take you with it. Remember what happened to Jack and that other miserable little one. The shopkeeper knew Orbitz only as the local politician of negligible importance, an unremarkable man trying to be remarkable. If Orbitz, in an uncharacteristic burst of candor, had described the torment that marked his childhood and which had left both scars and a faltering imagination, if he had spoken of the events that had forced him to return to his parents' house following his brother's suicide, only to witness the life squeeze out of both, if he had mentioned that for most of his life, always expecting rejection, he was forever preparing for it, If he had confessed any of this, the shopkeeper, a tiny man with an unevenly shaped mustache and bristly eyebrows that gave him a hurried and reflective look, would not have seen Orbits as any different from anyone in the island. But Orbits had grown to see himself as different and separate. For most of his life, he had little idea of what the future might bring. He never planned for anything, and when a little slice of luck fell his way, he briefly imagined it was the world settling itself, balancing the turmoil of his early years. I'm going to skip a few pages. Orbit had always lived in dread of the walk from his house to the school, and each morning and evening he tried to forget the nicknames and the bullying of the other boys by focusing on the buildings rather than their taunting inhabitants. If he were older and less traumatized, he might have noticed that every house had a different shape. Some were tall and angular like lighthouses, others squat like pillboxes, and yet others were roundish with many windows and doors. He may have noticed not only the profusion of fruity flavors and colors that tickle his appetite, but the range of building materials. Houses were built from concrete and brick alone, cedar and teak, corrugated aluminum and plywood. All were incomplete, even the elaborate structures. And this incompleteness gave the street the air both of stagnation and progress. As he hurried along, he wished he were living on another street in another village. But Orbit Street was no different from those in all the other villages in the island. Here, as elsewhere, wealth was displayed as prominently as grinding poverty, and a house was the most visible representation of status. The house in which he grew up was of middle size and ambition, and a passing traveler might see to know that its occupants were not farmers or tradespeople, nor were they contractors or proprietors. The traveler might guess at a profession, perhaps teaching, and he or she would not be far off the mark. Orbit's father was a self taught dentist. Every village had its own quack, and they were expected to extract teeth, install fillings, as well as fashion dentures. His father's lab was not in the village, but in a town about 5 miles away. To get there, the father had to get a taxi at the junction, which was an intersection of parlors and small dry goods shops opposite two rum shops. When his father had opened his office 18 years earlier, the town had been a place of family run stores, but over the years, all the gaps and spaces between the buildings were stuffed with parlors and stalls, some just 8 feet wide. The cubicles were congested with limers smoking and suiting the passing schoolgirls. Orbit School was in the opposite direction, and on his way there, he felt he was sinking deeper into the village, the opportunity for escape lessening with every footstep. After some brutal day, he would say, I finished with school. And his mother would reply, Don't worry, Chunkalunka. That baby fat will melt off just now. It increased every year. So Orbit was relieved when the new nickname stuck. And to ensure it would not be displaced, he would stop suddenly on the road and look up. Once in a while, he shaped his hand like a gun and shot at the birds that were obscuring his view of the sky and the clouds. Occasionally, a housewife would watch him from the window and ask, What that fat boy staring up at the sky like he crazy? And the husband would reply, Oh, that is Orbits. His father is the quack, swallows. As the years passed and he went from school to school, skipping classes and failing most of his exams, the name Orbit suited him even more. Teachers were especially cruel to him, and it was because of this group that he missed classes. During his first year at the high school, the teacher, an aristocratic whiskered man who walked like a general, lectured the class about students who had failed all the exams and who were herded into private schools like this, clogging up the classrooms. These students would forever be burdened to their parents, to teachers like himself, and to the island. Look at this beast here, hiding something in the sand and eating. The teacher, nicknamed Snake Belt, because the way he smoothly slipped off his belt, pointed his rod at Orbits. Come up, boy, and let me see what you're gobbling. A month earlier, Orbits had developed grainy warts on his fingers. His father's sulfurous connection, rather than removing the warts, had hardened them into thick brown scabs. Orbit had discovered that each time we bit off the scabs, the warts grew smaller. What is your name, boy? When Orbits remained silent, he added, You don't have a name? Eh? He swished his rod against his pants. My name is Orbits. What you say, boy? Horrific? Orifice? With every mispronunciation, the class bellowed. Orbits, he said quietly. Who gave you that name, boy? My father. Is it him who patched up that shoe to resemble an alligator? Orbit's father's penchant for inventive repairs extended his shoes, book bags, and uniform. Orbit tried to hide the offending shoe by crossing his legs and almost fell. Class erupted. Yes, sir, he said, his eyes burning. You know why he gave you that Orbit's name? It's because he wished you was far away from him. It's because he know that gobblers like you will bring down the entire family because of your licoriceness. Now open your hand and let me see what you was eating. Both hands. Reluctantly, Orbit pushed out his hands. The teacher got up from his desk. You blasted little cannibal. Is flesh you like to eat? Well, I going to help you with that. What you waiting for? Continue eating. Orbits look at his fingers and at the teacher and at the whole in class. Eh? Your belly full? The teacher repeated the sentence each time he brought down his rod on Orbit's hand, on the scabs he had been gnawing. Go and stand at the back of the class. When Orbits was walking to the back, a boy pushed out his leg and he tumbled. The teacher's annoyance changed to amusement. Fatboy Fall Down, he said, and the class erupted. Orbit swore eventually dropped out, but for months afterwards, he heard the taunt, Fat Boy Fall Down, in the corridors of the school.
I have to admit that listening, it was incredibly difficult to not burst out in laughter with every other sentence, even while I feel the plight of Orbit so acutely. And I think that this is something that Fat Boy Fall Down does with a real master touch. It balances what could seem like an extremely depressing life with these moments of extreme hilarity. And so I want to welcome everyone who's joining us from all around the world again to this episode of Bios and Bookmarks. And I'm speaking with Robin Maharaj, who you've just heard read from his newest book, Fat Boy Fall Down. And I feel like we, at the level of the title, is where I'd like us to begin our chat because it's the kind of phrase that you might not expect to be the name of a book, but it is so common to the ways that Trinese and perhaps other Caribbean people speak to each other. So if you could tell me about the genesis of the title, I would love to hear it.
Okay, well, first I'll tell you about a little bit about the genesis of the book itself because it's tied up with the genesis of the title. Um, about 4 years ago, I was in New Brunswick. I'd now gone there as a writer in residence. And a week after I arrived in New Brunswick, Fredericton, I got the news that my father had passed away. So I returned to Trinidad. And when I returned to Trinidad, just for a week for my father's cremation, and when I came back to New Brunswick, I was feeling extremely isolated and morose and everything else. And I was trying to think of my early years in Trinidad. And one of the things that struck me was that there was always a sense in growing up, in Trinidad, a sense of shame that you had to do this, you had to do that. And I felt that was, I had kind of forgotten about that after spending so many years in Canada. But, sometimes these traumatic events like the death in the family, it kind of transports you back to a particular kind of truth. It kind of strips away everything else. And the other thing that I thought about was the Trinidadians penchant for nicknaming people according to disabilities.
Mhm.
Now, I had to explain this to the Canadian audience because I felt that this was, why would you name a book Fatboy Fall Down? So I told them that when you grow, if you grow up in a place like Trinidad, people get the nicknames like Brokerfoot and Fat Boy and Bossy Back and young children, very young children. They get baby names, like Dolly and all sort of things that follow them even in their adult lives. So you hear, 40, 50-year-old women with childlike names and men with names like that. So yeah. So it was to kind of represent a certain kind of brutality on one level and a certain kind, I guess, I don't use, maybe I'll use the word honesty at the other level, where people just say the first thing that comes to their mind. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it couldn't ring any truer. I feel that Orbit is the very last person that you would expect to be at the center of a narrative, but in so many ways, he was somebody I deeply enjoyed spending time with. I felt that the way Orbits came to see the world had this uncanny combination of extreme sensitivity. Like he is able to pick out these moments of majestic beauty in the clouds and the natural landscape, tempered with a kind of growing, increasingly grim acceptance that people can only be as good as the institutions that are stifling them, that corruption and bureaucracy run rampant in society. So Orbitz is both a dreamer and also a realist. And I wanted to know what it was like to write about that balance of things, especially as he grew as a character.
Um, Well, I sort of I started the book from a particular kind of mood, and what I during the course of writing, there were several times that I was thinking about sort of giving the readers a certain kind of respite by allowing some kind of dramatic interruption, um, something light, something to take the focus off Orbit's growing realization of his life and the kind of continuity that marked his existence from his birth to his death. But I felt that that wouldn't have, it wasn't what I wanted to do. And while in a narrative sense, it was a risky thing to kind of depict a life like his, uninterrupted by any sort of dramatic sort of niceties, so or things that readers would want to kind of look forward to. But Orbits to me, he represented to some extent, and I didn't realize this until I was halfway in the book, he represented Trinidad. Um, and he was more than just this person. He represented this country that was kind of moving from one stage to the other slowly, very, very slowly, beginning to understand its past and trying to tie its past with its present. At one point in the book, towards the end, there's a section where Orbits um, he discovers a trove of old books, and from these books, he begins to see um, he begins to have a kind of more impersonal sort of idea of the way the world operates. Not something connected to himself, but the way old civilizations die, new ones are built upon the old one. and the ebb and flow of things. And so that was a very deliberate um, part there that I put in.
I feel that that ties in so well to thinking about the career that you give Orbits to pursue. That as a meteorologist, as a someone whose job it is to try to map the weather patterns and systems of a nation, he also spends a great deal of time thinking about inevitability in that role. That that no matter what you do or however you try to fashion your existence, things can be as immutable as the weather, and there's very little that can change that. And the persistence of cloud imagery in the novel I thought was so beautifully realized, because here are these things that are clouds must be one of the most romanticized images in certainly in English speaking literature. And to see clouds acquire a significance that has a bit more depth to it than that, a kind of an undertone that's almost menacing, was really gratifying. And as we're talking now, I feel that I have to ask you how you think Orbits would be coping in the time of COVID-19.
um, I think that if he were at the beginning of the book when he was a little boy, he would be happy at the fact that he was isolated because he had tried to devise means to isolate himself in any event. Um, but then again, as a young person, he would find it very difficult not to he would miss a certain degree of activity outside and so on. If he were there at the end of his book, at the end of the book, if this whole situation with COVID had was taking place, I think what he would do is he would tie it with the way he was apprehending himself and the world. Because, and I just want to add a little thing in addition to what you were talking about just now, and
Okay.
that is the what Orbitz was actually striving for, and he realizes late in the book, it wasn't so much happiness or satisfaction or fulfillment. It was self-awareness. And in this sense, the book is not a tragedy or anything like that because he actually got that. At various times, towards the end of the book, he was able to link all of the vicissitudes, all his the little mishaps and so on, even the pleasurable moments, into a landscape that offered him a clear view, a certain degree of clarity as to where he was and where he is now and where he'd probably be sometime in the future.
The people who are joining in and tuning into this conversation, this bios and bookmarks, are really enjoying your reading and your reflections. And to share some thoughts from them now, Hetty Sargent says, "Thank you, Mr. Mirage. It reminds me of the cruelty of the classroom in those days," referring to your reading, of course. And a sort of a contemplation from Celia Sohando, who says, "The cruelness of the classroom, character building or breaking." Juliet Smith says it's a complete luxury to be listening to your reading and our conversation. And thank you to everyone who's left their thoughts so far. As we continue this discussion, please don't hesitate to leave questions or comments for Robin, and we will definitely share those with him. And so I wanted to talk a bit about Orbit's relationship with Moon and the very traditional ways in which we often understand an affair to mean certain things in literature, that they are either refutations of something a character is trying to get away from. They're so closely linked to human ego and fragility, or the sense that a real human connection is trying to be made. And I felt that the relationship with Orbits and Moons seemed to be doing even more than that. And I really felt for both of them reading their scenes as people who were perhaps you wouldn't expect them to be drawn together, but the language of intimacy coupled with frustration that they shared was really moving to me. So I wonder if we could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, both Orbits and Moon, as well as Moon's husband, they both, I try to portray them as in a kind of, as much as I could, in a positive light, each of these three people were searching for some missing aspect of their lives. Orbit was trying to um, connect himself with something more integral in the village, a mixture of superstition, a mixture of wildness, a mixture of honesty, a mixture of all of these things. Moon, her husband, she was trying to deal with a certain degree of abandonment by
Mhm.
her husband, who, used to spend most of his evenings liming and drinking and so on. Um, and the husband too. I tried to portray him in a sort of gentle way, because there's a scene where he comes into Orbit's office and he doesn't announce the fact that he is Moon's husband. He
Mhm.
speaks in generalities and he tells Orbits, um, you know, um, there's this kind of situation and so on, so on, so. And Orbits begins to feel a certain degree of sympathy for him. And at the end, he is the person who replaces Moon's husband, who replaces Orbits as a county councillor. So each of these people, um, they were trying to search for a missing piece in their lives, and they found it, but temporarily. And Orbits and Moon, both of them sort of realized more or less at the same time that things are okay for certain things for short periods, but if you prolong it for then it becomes complicated. But in a narrative sense, so I had to include this um, relationship with a Moon, with somebody like her,
Mhm.
somebody completely the opposite of Orbit, somebody self-assured, somebody confident, and so on, in order for Orbits to move beyond a particular point in his life. And he did. He did.
It's the growth of orbits is something that I think readers of this book, and of course, if you have not had a chance to get your hands on a copy of Fatboy Fall Down, don't worry, because before the end of this conversation, we'll be putting links in our comments box on Facebook, so you can definitely check it out. So people who've read the book will see that it's easy enough to get an initial impression of orbits as almost a kunumunu, almost someone who is destined to fill a very sad and pathetic role in life, but the novel consistently finds ways to defy that expectation, to to defy the sense that here is a small and boring and ordinary life. I mean, Orbit's life has room for great romance. It has room for political strivings. He is much more than the sum of his parts. And Robin, I think you do this for every character in the book. It's not confined to Orbits. You kind of examine with real heart how every person, whether it's Moon or her husband or Cascadoo or the teachers, inhabit their own realms of fallibility. So that was deeply moving.
And I think that's something that's kind of common, I think, in Caribbean or in a broader sense in post-colonial literature, where a lot of writers take characters who are deeply flawed, who are not powerful at the lower end of every power relationship. And because of our colonial experiences, we take characters like these and we as our heroes, because it's the most common kind of archetype, the most common kind of people that you would see around you growing up in any event.
Okay, so Robin, you know that we at the Bocas Lit Fest have been working on the 100 Caribbean books that made us, an answer to an earlier BBC article about the 100 books that shaped our world. So we were curious about trying to find out what that looks like in a Caribbean space, what Caribbean books of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and plays have made us who we are. And so far, we've released a list of the most mentioned titles, which include, in large part, the kind of books that you would expect. So there's Fierce Nightfall, featuring heavily on that list alongside Sam Selvon, CLR James, Eric Williams. And I'd love to get your thoughts on what would make your own picks for such a list, whether it's the classics that many of us know and love and generations of us grew up studying, or more contemporary picks.
Um, I would. Um, I don't want to show any bias here to Canadian, Trinidadian writers who are living in Canada. But one of the books, I don't know if this was selected, and in fact, I just finished rereading this book, Map to the Door of No Return by Dion Brand. She's a Trinidadian poet, essayist, fiction writer. There's won numerous accolades here. Um, and there's another writer, Andrea Alexis. He's written a book called 15 Dogs. Um, I'm not sure if Wilson Harris was, if he was somebody that I didn't like in high school because I felt his books were so dense and so on. It took me a long while. In fact, it was only after university that I went back to his books and I actually saw, I enjoyed it and saw how different it was from most of the other. It was more, I guess, Latin American in flavor and style and spirit than Caribbean writing. Yeah, so most of the people that I would like to be there are there already. I don't have any secret favorites except, as I said, Diane Brand, perhaps, and all the usual suspects, Naipaul, Selvon, Lovelace, Walcott, all of them are there. Um, Michael Anthony, I mean, Green Days by the River, but almost all of his early books, I believe, are really, really good. And he wrote books that were sort of, nowadays they would be considered sort of young adult, but they represented a particular time in Trinidad so well. Yeah.
That is a very, as we would expect from you, a very generous and thoughtful selection. And I think it's a good reminder to all of us to focus on Canadian Caribbean literature because it has so much to offer us. I mean, Robin and I were talking just before we went live about the incredible wonder that is Dion Brand. And as I said to Robin, and I will say live for everyone to hear, I think his own books belong very solidly in this category. And if you are new to Robin's book, I would suggest you can begin with Fatboy Fall Down and work your way backwards. And you will see that a common thread of trying to understand people in all of their perfect imperfections is a hallmark of his writing. That these are characters who are not wooden stock figures, and they are as much products of their history, their their deep-rooted secrets, and their landscape as they are anything else. Another book I've loved of Robbins is The Amazing Absorbing Boy, which you could rightly call young adult literature, but I think would benefit from being read by everyone. So, Robin, I feel like now is a good time to invite you to do another short reading for us.
Okay, so I think we were talking a little bit before about um, how orbits was how he represented to some extent the island itself. So I am going to read a bit towards the end of the book. Late in the night on the porch, he wished he had known his brother, who had died a stranger. Maybe his brother knew him better, though. On one of the pages, he saw a cartoon of a boy sitting on a cloud. Beneath was a smaller figure looking up, his hands outstretched, either waving or trying to hitch a ride. This section I'm reading here, it occurs just after Orbitz discovers a box in which there are writings of his brother who had committed suicide. Orbitz didn't go to his office that week, and as he had done following the death of his parents, he waited. He felt along his entire body, weariness as a stroking finger one moment, as a crushing hand the next. He was not sure on what he was waiting, but the tiredness dipped and resurfaced during those days. He wondered what had happened if he just sent in a letter of resignation, even though he knew it was not easy to elect from his elected position as a county councillor. But these were idle thoughts. He was waiting for the moment he would feel grief and sadness and guilt, and from this mix he would perceive some new way of looking at the world, a vision that was temporary and deformed and fraudulent, but one that would allow him to carry on. As a preparation for this epiphany, he imagined the world was filled with suffering that served some mysterious purpose. He then reflected as to whether there was no grand purpose in life, but just a series of coincidences and random events that made men and women either lucky or blighted. He recalled his mother's view of the reincarnated form's existence as payment or punishment for the last life. But these were all beliefs he had heard of and read, so they came to him impersonally, as a remote conversation or drained words falling off a page. They offered none of the personal anguish for which he was searching, and which would agitate a sudden insight that was so simple and obvious it would clarify everything. He barely ate during the week, and on the morning of the third day, he felt a ravenous hunger he had not experienced since his time with his old friend Wally in Port of Spain. There's food in the kitchen, and I am famished, but I'm not eating. Why? He waited. Other questions arose, some so digressive and childlike he could barely understand their purpose. Why did the previous owner sell the house, and where is he now? Was he waiting all the time for someone like me to make an appearance? What will happen if I allow the vines along the trees to continue growing? And he waited and he waited. His hunger increased until it felt like a solid thing, a metal ball caught beneath his chest, rolling up and down like a pinball. Soon he could no longer feel it, and he feared it had looped somewhere else, hiding above an organ, waiting for him to fall asleep. One night, he awoke in a panic. The ball had splintered and was crushing him from inside, hollowing him out. The following night, he was jolted by another nightmare in which a teacher was telling him, "You brought down everybody in your family because of your licoriceness." Obed sat up on his bed. A teacher had actually used those words. He walked outside, close to the road, facing the abandoned school opposite. "How did I, of all people, manage to escape?" he asked. "What will be the cost I must pay later on? I blighted everyone and everything I touched, but I escaped. Why?" He stood there for hours until the night faded, the morning light filtering through the trees, weak and unsteady, bringing the old school into relief. He imagined the sound of children's laughter, the scraping of chairs, desk covers open and closed, chalk and a black boy. He pictured a little boy, slim, walking alone, his body straight, watching the game, three-hole marble and hoop, briefly interested in one game before moving on to another. No one was interested in him, and he returned their indifference. This frail little boy. At this moment, Orbit felt such tenderness for his little brother that his knees buckled, and he was forced to squat on the road. Eventually, he went to his closet and took out his white shirt and khaki pants. His hair was damp from the dew, and his one-week beard was flecked with gray. It was time to return to work.
Thank you for that, Robin. And for those of you who are joining us a bit late, not to worry. You will, of course, be able to see the entire episode from the beginning anytime you like, right here, archived on our Facebook. And Robin, listening to you read, I'm struck again by how deeply contemplative, almost philosophical, the experience of reading Fatboy Fall Down is. Because as you pointed out, and as is absolutely the case, the quest here is not the usual quest for so many great works of literature. The quest is for self-awareness over an ideal of happiness. And I think you do so well to show us how Orbits realizes this after a great deal of pain. I think it's a narrative that a lot of people can relate to in this age that surrounds us of COVID-19, which is deeply uncertain. And I think based on that, I would like to know how you feel this book sort of sits in conversation and in company with all the other novels that you've written. Because you've had such a prolific career, it's something I'm always so curious about. So I'd like to know what that feels like for you.
Well, I wouldn't have attempted to write a book like this early on in my career because of what I'd mentioned before, because of the narrative structure and the sort of unrelenting focus on a particular life without any sort of diversion. Um, it's difficult to say, I'll be honest, I can't judge my books myself. I do know that um, the closest I can get to is the books that were easy to write, are the ones that I enjoyed writing, and the ones I felt pleasure in finishing. This book, I think, is closer to a perfect pledge than
Mm,
most of my other books, simply because it's set, well, for one reason, because it's set in Trinidad, um, and A Perfect Pledge was multi-generational, and for a long time, I believe that that was the best book I'd written, and maybe to some extent, I still have this sense too, because it took a fairly long time, um, and when I had finished the book, I just felt so much relief. So I don't know if that's part of it. But each book, I try to bring something a little, I try to explore something slightly different. But of course, most writers, we tend to deal with particular sort of themes without realizing it in a recurrent kind of manner. But if that is true, and I know it is, what I try to do is to deal with these recurrent themes in a different kind of way. I'm pleased with this book. And when I had finished writing, I wrote this book to clarify certain things about Trinidad for me and about life. And I wrote this book as I wouldn't have been able to write a book like this when I was in my 40s or 30s or anything like that. This is a book that somebody who is of a particular kind of age, you have to be an older person who's looking back at life and
mm,
trying to form connections between things that you didn't see at the moment. Um, and one of the things that Orbits learned to do is to forgive everybody at the end. Everybody who has, even the teacher, who he has another encounter with. So that way of looking, that sort of philosophical kind of way of looking at things, I wouldn't have been able to write a book like this early on. I think, you know what? Every book, my last book is always my favorite book for
mm.
a while.
I think that's
Yeah.
a really diplomatic stance to take with your own writing. Like if you think of books as quarrelsome children fighting among themselves, they're all an equal amount of love. And we have fans of your writing who are here with us in the comment section. We have Rust Cole who says that they just want to big up Laga, who's apprentice as well. So it's lovely to be surrounded in this conversation by people who are both new to your work as well as familiar with it. I mean, I can't get over what you said about it takes a certain measure of years to write a book like this. And I suppose that is true. And structurally, you see that in the book as well. So many things that we were exposed to in Orbit's childhood come back full circle by the end of the book. And in a while, that might be a very classic structure. I feel that you're doing so much to make that circular and cyclical journey your own. Like there's a point towards the end of the book where Orbit says to himself, or the thing that he thinks he might say to himself is, I am no longer a little fat boy afraid of the world. And I think you come to realize all the ways that that is both true and maybe not true. And I I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about whether by the end of his journey or towards the end of his journey, there are things that Orbits refuses to think about or acknowledge to himself. I feel that you give him at all times this capacity to have a deep and rich inner and secret life, which sometimes not even the reader is privy to.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about Trinidadians and people from the Caribbean generally, but Trinidadians in particular, is we live parallel lives. We have this public life, and then we have all these different masks that we put on. And I think that, so somebody who in one situation is something could be completely different in a particular kind of situation because of the mask he or she chooses to wear. And even from small, I used to always wonder about the confluence of these different personas in a person. Where would it meet, and what's going to create what's there at the moment of complete honesty? If you take off all these masks, is there something completely unexpected, or is there another mask? That sort of thing. So yeah, so it's I think that if orbits were here in term, you asked the question earlier, if orbits were here during this kind of pandemic, this kind of situation, I think one of the things that he would pinpoint, or one of the things that he would focus on, is hypocrisy, um, because he needed to clear away that particular um, trait before he could understand himself and understand others. And he was very, very much, sort of the people that he met. That was something that he was always on the lookout for. So he would look at what's happening in America and so on, and he would see, actually, his reaction in America might be stronger than hypocrisy, or something else. He was also on the lookout for lunacy.
Mhm. Well, he would probably find a great deal of it there. he, Kirk Bajan in the comments is echoing the love for one of your previous books. He says, I love The Lagahoo's Apprentice. It's nice to get an insight into the author. Great series. And we have a comment from Motilal Bhutu Singh who says he did a course, Advanced Creative Writing, with you, and that it was awesome.
I remember him very well, yes.
So, Robin, I mean, the comment section is warming my heart today. We have ample evidence of many lives that you've touched with your writing and your generosity and your kindness. And I feel like, oh, Modila is following up to say, I have my autographed copy of A Perfect Pledge. He agrees that it would appeal more to older people. As a well, I think I am not yet an older people, and I have to say it appealed very much to me. So you have your fans across all generations. I mean, Robin, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you. I feel like now is a good time for us to, all of our bios and bookmarks regulars know this game. It's called the Three Envelopes. The premise is very simple. I'm holding up envelopes 1 through 3 to Robin. He will choose a question, and then we will engage with that question. So, Robin, 1, 2, or 3.
Hmm. Let's choose 3.
All right. In envelope number 3, the question is, what is one thing that can immediately transport you back home to Trinidad? Is it a beloved book, a dish, or a song, or something else?
It depends really on the time of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I, whenever, this would sound really childish, but during Christmas time, sometimes I'd be in the grocery and I'd get a faint whiff of apple or something like that. And I remember these sort of corrugated cardboard things they used to pack apple, and they had this odor I went to Nakrima College, and when you went down High Street, you would smell that from a mile away. So the aroma is something that's important. I think um, of particular things. Like, for instance, another thing that I remembered too, and I don't know, I got a whiff of something a couple of Christmas back, and I was transported straight to the village where a neighbor had an oven made of a barrel. And in that she used to bake cake and whatnot, and you could smell it from miles away. So, I think aromas and odors and so on, these things tend to trigger my memory and send me straight back to Trinidad. And as I said, it's usually a kind of seasonal thing. I
Mhm.
find myself thinking about Trinidad in a more nostalgic manner during Christmas time, with parang music. If I put on that once the season starts. And yeah, so I guess it's an aroma of something that I connect with my childhood in the village.
That is a beautiful answer. I think it's a lovely point on which to bring this episode of Bios and Bookmarks to a close. So, for those of you who would like to get your hands on Fatboy Fall Down, please check our comments section for links, direct links to the book on the publisher's website at ECW Press. If you don't feel like reading the text, I have fantastic news for you. Well, first of all, you should read the text, but also there is an audiobook of Fatboy Fall Down, narrated by none other than legendary local thespian Errol Sitahal, and I think it will be a complete delight. I have heard it, but now I'm very tempted to get that as well. Robin, thank you so much for joining us. It has been amazing getting to think about the interior and private world of Orbits, and also to think about what he would do during a pandemic. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Shivani. Thank you very much.